Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Chapter 3 discussions. Including external sources is a key part of the literature review process, but it's not always as easy as it sounds to identify good external sources. In this lecture video, we're going to explore the publishing process, and I'll teach you the indicators of a good primary source. Now, when I say primary sources, I'm referring to peer-reviewed journal articles. This is because these sources provide new and original work by an author. Oftentimes, these sources contain new research, and these are called empirical articles. Empirical means that the research was based on systematic observations, experimentation, or experiences by the author. In my courses, I usually refer to these simply as research articles. Peer-reviewed articles may also be literature reviews themselves. These articles spend the whole article exploring a topic of interest and pointing out research gaps to the reader. This is a common student product for peer-reviewed journals, as undergraduate and graduate students who conduct literature reviews for their classes can sometimes put together a literature review article for a journal publication. The last type of peer-reviewed article is a theoretical article. In theoretical articles, the author presents a new theory or discusses an existing one. Like literature reviews, they're going to usually discuss the current state of knowledge about a topic, but then they're going to focus on how that knowledge influences the theory that they're either suggesting or critiquing. If you want to know what kind of article you're reading, I recommend looking for a methods section. An empirical article will include a methods section, as well as the traditional results and discussion section, because the author is going to have to describe how they gathered their empirical data. On the other hand, literature reviews and theoretical articles will not include a methods section because they're not collecting data themselves. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term peer review before, and most likely it's been stressed in multiple classes as the good source. But oftentimes students are unaware as to what this process actually includes. The term peer-reviewed is reserved for manuscripts who are reviewed by experts in a particular area of study. This makes the peer review process unique from that of a book or newspapers. In both of those situations, the content gets looked over by an editor. Oftentimes, this editorial review is more about grammatical and structural issues, although it can also involve a content critique. The peer review process, though, is much more extensive, and let's go over that process step by step. So it starts with a manuscript submission. Most commonly in today's world, the submission begins when an author uploads their manuscript to the journal website. The manuscript is then sent to the journal editor. Editors are usually appointed positions, and most often are held by academic professionals as an extra job on top of their full-time position. The editor will read through the manuscript, and from there, the editor has two choices. They can choose to reject the manuscript right off the bat, and that's called a desk reject, or they can send it out for further review. When they send out a paper, they're going to send it out to researchers who have education or experience in that particular topic area. Usually, the magic number that it's sent out to are 3 reviewers. Each reviewer will be asked to review the manuscript and to make a decision about the quality of the work. Editors are asked to critique the study purpose, the methodology, the findings and the conclusions, as well as the overall writing and the organizational structure of the article. At the end of their review, reviewers make a recommendation to the editor about whether this manuscript is acceptable as is, whether it needs further revision, minor or major, or whether it should be rejected. The editor of the journal will then gather up all 3 reviews and make a final decision. The 3 decisions that the editor can make at this stage are to reject the article entirely, to request that the author revise the paper and resubmit it, or to accept the article. Articles rarely get an out-and-out acceptance. Instead, the revise and resubmit, also called the R&R, is the most common decision for papers that will eventually get published. So now the author knows that the editor liked the paper, but the editor and the reviewers think there are things that need to be revised. The author will usually receive a copy of all 3 reviewers' comments, as well as editor comments if there are any. Now comes the hard part. Now the author will revise the original manuscript, addressing every concern that was raised by all 3 reviewers and the editor. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to change everything that was requested, but it does mean that they have to argue why they won't change it if they choose not to do so. The author will then submit the revised manuscript and a letter to the editor that documents all of the changes that they made. Best case scenario, the editor looks over the paper, agrees with him, and accepts the paper as is. However, most times the editor will then restart the manuscript review process. The editor may ask the previous 3 research experts to look over the paper again, or they may find new experts. Those experts review, write a letter of recommendation, and the process continues. So the submission can get stuck in a cycle of review and revision several times. I've had colleagues that have had 4 or 5 cycles of revision. And it can be very challenging, particularly if you get different reviewers the second and third time, as those reviewers may not just find different things wrong in your paper, they may also disagree with some of the previous revisions requests. So then you end up having to decide which suggestion will best improve your paper, and then you have to argue why you did or didn't make those changes to the editor. Finally, if you are lucky, you get out of the review process and your manuscript is accepted for publication. The whole process of peer review can be lengthy. Best case, the reviewers are given 4 to 6 weeks each to return their review. Sometimes they're given 60 to 90 days, and sometimes they're late. It may take 4 or 6 months just to get the first decision back on your paper. And then you still have edits and you have to revise and resubmit. So, and again, if the peer review process starts again and you go through that cycle, you're in for at least another several months of waiting. Huseman and Smith studied articles that were submitted to a large publisher website to examine the time that it took to go through the review process and to compare that between fields of study. With respect to the humanities, which is where we are, they found that it took an average of 14 days to receive a simple desk reject. Remember, that occurs when the editor deems the manuscript unworthy of being sent out on review and rejects it on the spot. For those articles that made it through the peer review process, they found that it took an average of 16 weeks, or almost 4 months, for the author to receive any response on their paper, whether that be a reject, a revise or submit, or an acceptance. Overall, they found that accepted articles spent an average of 22 weeks in review. This is almost 6 months. And if you consider the fact that this number is an average, that means 50% of accepted articles will take longer than this. Additionally, they found that accepted papers in the humanities will go through approximately 2.02 rounds of review, meaning that most papers will go through either 2 or 3 rounds of review before being accepted. Just to give you an idea of the process, here are 2 of my recent experiences. As you can see from the one on the left, I had a really quick turnaround with this journal. Part of this is because the editor of that journal that I was publishing with has a really strict turnaround policy, and he likes to get things back to the author within 90 days. So the revise and resubmit decision and the eventual acceptance all occurred within a few months of the submission process. On the other hand, Dr. Klein and I published a piece recently, and it went through a little bit more complicated process. We submitted it to the same journal as my previous article, but we received a desk reject. We used the editor's comments to make some changes, and then we quickly submitted it to a new journal that same month. From that journal, we received a revise and resubmit decision 4 months later. We made our revisions quickly again, we turned the article back into them within a few days, and it went back out under peer review. 2 of the original reviewers looked over the piece again, and it appeared from the comments that there was also 1 new reviewer. The revisions they requested the second time were pretty minor, so we were able to make the appropriate edits and respond again within a few days. This time we got an acceptance from the editor without sending it out for another round of reviews. This process is pretty representative of the average review discussed in the previous slide because it went through 2 rounds of peer review, but that took us almost a full year to get that article published and accepted. Now here's the key issue with peer-reviewed sources. Even though they are the preferred type of source, they still aren't always the legitimate articles they appear to be. Unfortunately, today's digital world has allowed what are known as predatory journals to thrive. Predatory journals are known as pay-to-publish journals. They charge the author a publishing fee, usually $1,000 or even more, but they guarantee an acceptance. Although they may state that they have a peer review process, they will either fake the reviews and they won't send them out at all, or they have some system where things get expedited unfairly. For academics, predatory journals are an easy, albeit expensive, method of getting our work out. But why do you care as a student, right? Easy. Predatory journals encourage the public of junk science. They don't care what the manuscript is, they don't care how good the methods are, they don't care what the author's conclusions are based on, they simply want the fee to publish. Junk science can include research that's been subjected to scientific misconduct, things that wouldn't pass peer review, research that's been supported by companies or institutions with a conflict of interest, or it could simply be research that just isn't high quality enough to publish in a mainstream journal. None of these are the type of research that you want to be looking at when legislators are determining where and what services to fund for your community. The worst part is that predatory journals are usually open access, meaning that anyone can download the articles for free. So they're actually more easily available than many articles from legitimate peer-reviewed journals, because oftentimes those can only be downloaded for expensive fees. Meaning that junk science articles could easily become the future or the basis of future laws and intervention programs if they're downloaded and then given to the right people because they look and sound legitimate. As a reader, what kind of red flags should you look for to know if you're dealing with a predatory journal? First, be wary of journals that are not open access. There is a huge push in the mainstream industry to move towards an open access model. So being open access doesn't automatically mean you're dealing with a predatory journal. But most predatory journals are open access, so it is something to watch out for. Another indication is to look at the submission and the publication date, which are usually provided on the first page of the article. Predatory journals, because they fake the peer review process, will have very fast turnarounds between a submission and the publication of an article. For example, here's a hoax article that was offered to the predatory journal Psychology and Psychotherapy Research Study. Although the fancy title sounds academic, the paper is actually about the butt-wiping habits of politicians. The author's hypothesis was that left-wing politicians will wipe their butt with their right hand, and right-wing politicians will wipe their butt with their left hand. As you can see from the publication dates here, the article was accepted within 3 weeks. For a real peer review to have gone from editor to research expert and back to editor, that's a really fast turnaround. Suspicious. Mr. Louise's article describing his publishing process of his article and a copy of this very article are provided on my website if you're interested. The other red flag to look at is the other journal articles in the journal. Usually predatory journals will have a wide range of unrelated articles because remember, they don't care what the article is about so long as they get their fee to publish it. I have received several emails requesting me to publish in a predatory journal, saying that they loved my 2007 piece that I discussed on the previous slide and that they would love the opportunity to feature my work in a future edition of their own. Now, I'd be flattered, but the 2017 article was on the impact of sex offender policy on sex offender spouses. And my invitations to publish, well, they've come from economics journals, political science journals, and even a nursing journal. So if you see journals or you see articles from multiple disciplines, even those that aren't relevant to the journal title, you should be suspicious about the possibility of a predatory journal. Now, scientists have been trying to keep track of predatory journals, although this is a bit of a challenge given how easily they can pop up. One of the most extensive lists was created by librarian Jeffrey Beal. He published an extensive list of predatory journals and publishers, and he's listed them on a blog website shown on this slide. So if you ever have a journal article that you're suspicious about, you can look through both the journal names and the publisher lists on Beal's list using the link here to see if it's considered predatory. That may or may not give you some help on a class activity coming up soon. Okay, so now you know what type of sources are good to use. Let's discuss how you figure out which sources to use in your literature review. The best way is to look over the title and the abstract. The abstract should be a paragraph, usually 200 to 300 words, and that's going to walk you through the entire paper. A good abstract will give you the research purpose, a short description of the methods that were used, what the authors found when they analyzed the data, and a discussion of why that finding is important. Use the abstract to determine if the subject is relevant to your particular research topic. Maybe it's related through a keyword, but it's actually off topic. The abstract should help you narrow down your list. When you're reviewing the source, also evaluate the publishing date. Generally, we want sources that are contemporary, meaning they have been written recently. Your book gives the definition of contemporary as 5 to 7 years. You can even go so far as 10 to 15 years, depending on the type of source and the type of research question. For example, the census data is only released every 10 years, so you may have to go back that far to get the data you need. However, Don't grab census data from the 1990s. That's way too far away from the current time period, and you're not going to find that source helpful for contemporary issues. Now, that doesn't mean you will never include older references. Oftentimes, there are seminal pieces that you need to include, such as the person who originally wrote the theory that you are using. One of the ways to identify a seminal source is to look at the citation count in Google Scholar. The photographs here show some of the seminal pieces of criminological theory. Notice the citations range in the thousands, or even the tens of thousands. This indicates that these pieces, however old, are probably important. However, if you wanted to cite something about the current state of policing, you shouldn't use that source from the 1960s. So be aware of the time period. One of the questions that students always ask is, how many sources do you need? When do you stop searching? The decision to stop searching is rather subjective. Ideally, you search until you've reached saturation. Saturation means that you keep coming across the same information, so you're not finding anything new. For example, if you search multiple search terms in your database and you keep coming back with the same 20 to 30 articles, then you've reached saturation. You may want to make sure you're not missing anything important, but don't feel like you need to include every article ever written about your topic in your lit review. All right, well, that concludes the second lecture video for Chapter 3. Join me in the next lecture video as I describe the steps of the literature review process.